My wife had strictly forbidden me from visiting her late parents' farmhouse, but after her death, the lawyer handed me the keys and said, "Now it's yours." I planned to sell it, but curiosity got the better of me. When I opened the door, I could barely breathe, because inside was a woman I didn't recognize, sitting at the kitchen table like she belonged there, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, completely calm. She looked up at me and said, "You must be Daniel. I've been waiting 11 years. My name is Daniel Merritt. I am 51 years old. I have worked as a licensed electrician for the past 26 years, mostly commercial work, office buildings, small manufacturing plants, the occasional school renovation. I drive a 2018 Chevy Silverado with a toolbox welded to the bed and a crack in the lower left corner of the windshield that I have been meaning to fix for the past 2 years and probably will not fix until the summer. I live in a 2-bedroom house on Arbor Street in Maplewood, New Jersey, which is the same house I moved into when I married Carol 14 years ago, and the same house I have been living in alone for the past 11 months since Carol died. Carol died on a Thursday in February, pancreatic cancer. She was 48 years old. From the first diagnosis to the end was 14 weeks, which is one of those facts I have turned over in my mind so many times since then that it has almost lost its shape, the way a word stops looking like a word if you stare at it long enough. 14 weeks. We had 14 weeks between the afternoon she came home from the doctor's office and sat at the kitchen table and didn't say anything for almost 20 minutes, and the morning I sat in a chair next to her hospital bed and watched her breathing slow down and then stop. We had been married 9 years. We met through a mutual friend at a birthday party in Hoboken on a Saturday night in October, and within 6 months we were living together. And within 2 years of that, we were married in a small ceremony at a restaurant in Montclair with 31 people present, half of whom were Carol's colleagues from the financial consulting firm where she worked as a senior analyst. I was the kind of person who found it difficult to be in a room with 31 people. Carol was the kind of person who could make each of those 31 people feel like the most important person in the room without appearing to try. I did not entirely understand what she was doing with me. I asked her once, maybe a year into our marriage, what she had seen in me at that birthday party, and she said she'd watched me spend 45 minutes in the corner talking to a man's elderly father who didn't know anyone else at the party, and she'd thought, "That's the kind of person I want to know." I remembered that night. The man's father had been a retired plumber from Parsippany. We talked about pipe fittings and the particular indignity of modern flexible supply lines for the better part of an hour, and I had genuinely enjoyed it. That was Carol. She noticed things about people that those people didn't notice about themselves, and she stored those things carefully, and she used them to love people in the specific way those people needed to be loved. I was not always good at this. I was sometimes oblivious and occasionally obtuse and frequently too tired from 12-hour commercial jobs to be the kind of husband I wanted to be. But Carol seemed to understand something about me that I was still in the process of understanding about myself. And for 9 years, that understanding was the best thing in my life. There were things about Carol I did not understand. I want to be honest about that. She was a private person in a way that went beyond introversion, a way I could sometimes feel like a wall when I got too close to it. There were subjects she didn't discuss. Her parents, for instance. Her father had died when she was 26. Her mother 2 years after that, both of cancer, which Carol mentioned once and did not mention again. She had a small collection of photographs on the mantle, the same photographs for 9 years, never rearranged, never added to. When I asked about them early in our relationship, she gave me the names and relationships and nothing else, in the tone of someone reciting information rather than sharing it. I learned not to push. The farmhouse was the most closed subject of all. She mentioned it for the first time on our third date, and only because I asked about her parents' estate. I was making conversation. She said there was a farmhouse in upstate New York that had belonged to her parents and was still technically in the estate, and that she handled the property taxes and maintenance herself, and that it was not a place she planned to do anything with. I asked if I could see it sometime. She looked at me with an expression I would learn to recognize over the years, not unfriendly, but absolute, and said no, just that, no. And then she changed the subject so smoothly that I was halfway through my entree before I realized we'd moved on. Over the 9 years of our marriage, I asked about the farmhouse 4 times. The first time was about a year in, when she mentioned she was driving up to check on something, and I offered to come along. She said she'd rather go alone and thanked me for offering. The second time was maybe 3 years in, when I found a folder of property tax receipts in her filing cabinet while I was looking for our car insurance paperwork. I asked her about it at dinner, and she said the farmhouse needed more upkeep than she'd expected and that she was handling it. The third time was after her mother died, when I thought grief might open the door to whatever she was keeping behind it. She cried quietly at the kitchen table for a while and then went to bed, and when she came out the next morning she was Carol again, steady, organized, making coffee, and the door was closed. The fourth time I asked, she said, "Daniel, the farmhouse is not something I'm going to talk about, and I need you to be okay with that." She said it without anger, without drama, looking at me from across the kitchen with the honest, direct gaze that was one of the things I loved most about her. I told her I was okay with it. After that, I didn't ask again. I want to say I was incurious by nature, and that's why I let it go. But that's not entirely honest. I let it go because I trusted her, and because the marriage was good, and because I understood from fairly early on that Carol had a history that didn't include me, and that I was not going to be invited into all of it. Some people are like that. They partition. They they manage. You can love a person completely and still not have access to every room in them. I had decided, somewhere in the middle years of our marriage, that I was at peace with that. Most of the time, I actually was. After she died, I was not at peace with it. I spent the first 4 months after Carol's death doing what people do, working because work had to be done, eating badly, sleeping in fragments, cleaning the house in sudden compulsive bursts at 11 o'clock at night, and then sitting in the quiet afterward wondering what I was doing. I thought about the farmhouse more than I expected to. It had been a closed subject for 9 years, and now Carol was gone, and there was no one left to close it. I thought about it the way you think about a locked door when the person who held the key has died. Part of me wanted to know what was on the other side. Part of me was afraid to. The lawyer's name was Gerald Foss. He had been Carol's attorney for the past 6 years, handling her will and her estate planning, and I had met him once before, briefly, at a dinner party Carol had organized for some of her colleagues. He was a careful, quiet man in his mid-60s who wore bow ties and spoke with the measured cadence of someone who had spent decades delivering difficult information and had developed a specific professional kindness for the task. He called me in March, 4 months after Carol's death, and asked me to come to his office in Midtown. I drove in on a Wednesday morning and sat across from him at a long table in a conference room that looked out onto a gray March sky. He had a manila envelope and a set of keys on the table between us. He explained that Carol's estate was straightforward. The house, the savings account, the 401k, all of which transferred to me as the primary beneficiary without complication. He pushed the keys across the table and told me they were to the farmhouse in Dutchess County. He told me the farmhouse and the 4 acres around it were mine. He told me there was a letter inside the manila envelope from Carol, and that he strongly recommended I read it before I drove to the farmhouse. He said that last part carefully. He said, "I want to be clear that what you're going to learn is significant, and that reading the letter first will give you important context." He said it in the way a doctor says, "I'd like you to sit down before I tell you the results." I asked him if he could tell me what was in the letter. He said he could not, that Carol had been very specific that the letter was meant to speak for itself, and that his role was only to make sure I had it before I made any decisions about the property. He told me he was sorry for my loss, and that in his experience of Carol, which was 6 years of professional contact, estate reviews, document drafting, she had been one of the most deliberate and careful people he had represented, and that whatever I was about to learn, she had thought about it for a long time. I drove home. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Carol had sat when she came home from the doctor 14 weeks before she died, and I opened the envelope. There was a single folded sheet of paper inside. It was handwritten in Carol's careful, even handwriting, the handwriting that always looked to me like something a teacher would put on a blackboard. I had 4 birthday cards from her in a box in the bedroom closet, and every year her handwriting had looked exactly the same, unhurried, precise, each letter distinct. I read the letter. It said, "Daniel, by the time you read this, I will be gone, and Gerald will have given you the keys, and you are going to drive to the farmhouse and find something there that I should have told you about a long time ago. I am sorry that I did not. I have been trying to find a way to tell you for most of the 9 years we were married, and I never found it, which is a failure I want to own completely and not explain away. It was not that I didn't trust you. It was that I had spent so long carrying something alone that I had stopped knowing how to put it down. There is a woman at the farmhouse named Ruth Okafor. She is 67 years old, and she has been living in the farmhouse's guest cottage for the past 11 years. She will tell you everything. Before she does, I want to tell you this. The thing you are about to learn does not change what we had. It cannot change it. I know you will be angry, and I know you will grieve this in a way that is different from the way you have been grieving, and I know that is my fault. But I also know you. I have known you for 11 years, and I know that when you come back from being angry, you will be the person who spent 45 minutes talking to a stranger's father at a party in Hoboken, and that person is going to do the right thing. I love you. I have loved you since that night, and I will love you past whatever comes after this. Go to the farmhouse, read what Ruth gives you, then decide. I trust you completely. Carol. I read the letter 3 times. I sat at the kitchen table for approximately 2 hours without moving. I thought about calling someone, my brother, maybe, or my friend Marcus from work, who had known Carol and who had come to the funeral and who I had not spoken to since. I did not call anyone. I made a pot of coffee. I drank 2 cups standing at the kitchen counter, looking out at the backyard, where the garden Carol had planted along the back fence was still there, dormant, waiting for a spring that neither of us had planned for. I poured the rest of the coffee into a thermos. I put on my jacket and got in the truck. The farmhouse was in Dutchess County, about an hour and 40 minutes from Maplewood if you took the Palisades up to the thruway. I had lived in New Jersey for 20 years and had been to Dutchess County exactly once, years before I met Carol, for a friend's wedding in Rhinebeck. I remembered rolling hills and old stone walls and the particular quality of the light in the Hudson Valley in summer, which was golden and slow and nothing like the light in northern New Jersey. It was March now. The trees were bare. The light was gray and flat, and the road was empty in the way that 2-lane roads in the Northeast are empty in the middle of a Wednesday morning, the silence after the commute, before the lunch traffic. I did not think about the letter while I drove. This was deliberate. I had found, in the month since Carol died, that I could manage difficult things by dividing them into the part I was doing right now and the part I would deal with later, and driving was driving, and the letter would still be the letter when I arrived. I listened to the radio, the news, and then a program about jazz paths that I did not entirely follow. I stopped once for gas in a town called Fishkill. I looked at my phone in the parking lot of the gas station and thought about calling Gerald Foss to ask him what was in the letter, and then decided not to because Carol had said to go to the farmhouse, and I was going to the farmhouse. I found the property on a county road about 6 miles outside a small town called Millbrook. The directions Carol had given Gerald, which he'd forwarded to me, said to turn left at a white mailbox with the number 4447, which was sitting at the end of a gravel driveway about a quarter mile from the main road. I turned in and drove slowly, the gravel crunching under my tires in the particular way that gravel crackles when it's still half frozen from winter. The property opened up around a bend. The farmhouse was white, 2 stories, with a wide front porch and a stone chimney and what looked like new windows in the upper floor. There was a detached garage to the left, and behind it, partially screened by a stand of air maples, a small cottage, white to match the main house with its own porch. Both buildings were clean and maintained. The flower beds along the front porch were bare but edged. Someone had been out here regularly. Someone had been taking care of this place. I sat in the truck for a while. I looked at the house and I thought about Carol driving up here, the drive I had never taken with her, the road I had never seen, the driveway I had never known existed. I thought about the number of times I had watched her pack a bag on a Friday evening and leave early on a Saturday morning, back by dinner, quiet and tired in a way I had always attributed to the drive. 9 years of Saturdays, not every Saturday, but enough. Enough that when I sat in the truck looking at the house, it felt like standing in a room you've been told about your whole life and only now walked into, and finding it exactly as described, and not knowing whether that is comforting or devastating. I got out of the truck. I walked up the porch steps. I knocked. Nobody answered. I tried the door. It was unlocked. The front hallway smelled like wood smoke and coffee and something faint underneath that I didn't have a name for. Something old and domestic. The smell of a house that had been lived in steadily for a long time. To the left was the living room. To the right was the staircase. Straight ahead was the kitchen. She was sitting at the kitchen table. She was a black woman, late 60s, with gray natural hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and the unhurried posture of someone at home. She was wearing a dark green cardigan over a collared shirt, and there was a mug of coffee in her hands and a book open on the table in front of her. And she looked up at me when I walked in with an expression that was not surprise. It was something else. It was the expression of someone who has been waiting for a specific thing and has now seen it. She said, "You must be Daniel. I've been waiting 11 years. I stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her for a moment. I said, "You must be Ruth." She said yes. She asked me if I wanted coffee. I said yes. She got up and poured it without asking how I took it and set it on the table, and I sat down, and for a minute neither of us said anything. And that minute had the particular density of 2 people who have both been handed the same enormous thing from opposite directions and are each trying to figure out where to set it down. Then Ruth said, "Did you read Carol's letter?" I said yes. She said, "Then you know there are things I need to tell you." I said yes. She folded her hands on the table and looked at me in the quiet, careful way of someone who has rehearsed what comes next many times and is now setting the rehearsal aside because the real thing is different from the rehearsed thing, and she knows it. She said, "I want to start at the beginning, if that's all right with you, because none of the rest of it makes sense without the beginning." I said that was fine. This is what Ruth told me. Carol grew up in Millbrook. Her father was a high school history teacher, and her mother was a bookkeeper at a local insurance agency. And by all the accounting that Ruth had collected over the years, they were decent, steady, private people, the kind of people who showed up where they were supposed to show up and did what they said they were going to do and did not have a lot of patience for disorder. Carol was their only child. She was quiet and bright and had what her mother apparently called an old soul, by which Ruth understood she meant that Carol had a quality of stillness about her from a young age, a patience that seemed out of place in a child and that her parents probably took some credit for. Carol got pregnant at 19. She was home from her first year at SUNY Binghamton for the summer, and she had been seeing a boy she'd met on campus, a junior named Thomas, who was from Poughkeepsie, and who, by Ruth's account of what Carol had told her over the years, was not a bad person, but was not prepared for what happened, and did not particularly rise to the occasion when it did. Carol found out in July. She was home, living with her parents, working at a hardware store in town. She was 19 years old. She told her parents in August. Ruth paused here. She picked up her coffee mug, took a long, slow sip, and set it back down. She said, "Carol never told me exactly what that conversation was like. She'd given me pieces of it over the years, but she could never get through the whole thing without stopping. What I know is that her parents sat her down at the kitchen table. She said it was this kitchen, which was their kitchen then, and told her they loved her and that they were not going to turn their backs on her. Those were the good parts. The rest of it was harder. Carol's father said there was one path forward that preserved the family and Carol's future, and that path was adoption. Carol's mother cried through most of the conversation. They told her that if she kept the baby, she was on her own. Not out of cruelty, they said, but because they didn't have the resources and they were not prepared to raise another child, and Carol was 19 and needed to finish her education. They told her she could come home for the rest of the pregnancy, have the baby, place the baby with a good family, and then go back to school in January like it had not happened. They told her no one outside the immediate family needed to know. Carol agreed. She was 19 years old and she was sitting in this kitchen and her mother was crying and she agreed. Ruth and her husband Marcus had been trying to adopt for 4 years. They were living in Poughkeepsie at the time. Marcus was an engineer. Ruth had been a social worker for 15 years and had recently left the agency to take care of Ruth's mother, who was ill. They had been through 2 failed adoption processes before they were connected with a private agency in Millbrook, and when Carol's parents contacted that agency in September, Ruth and Marcus were the first family the agency called. Ruth met Carol twice before the baby was born. The first time was at the agency office, a brief meeting, mostly procedural, though Ruth remembered Carol sitting across from her at a conference table, looking like someone who was trying very hard to appear older than she was. The second time was at the hospital, 2 days after the birth, when Ruth and Marcus came to complete the paperwork. Carol had named the baby Maya. Ruth said, "I want to be clear that nobody asked her to do that." The agency had a standard protocol. Many birth mothers choose not to name the baby because it makes the separation easier. Carol named her anyway, in writing, on the form, and below the name she had written a note to us. It said, "Please keep this name. It is the only thing I get to give her." I put my coffee cup down. I looked at the table. Ruth said, "We kept the name." Of course we kept the name. She was Maya from the first day, and she has been Maya ever since. Maya was born on a Thursday in November 26 years ago. She was healthy. She was, by Ruth's account, a beautiful baby, though Ruth said she was aware of her own bias on the subject. Carol signed the final papers on a Saturday, 2 days after the birth. Ruth said Carol did not cry in the room where they signed. She held Maya for about 20 minutes before Ruth and Marcus took her to the car, and in those 20 minutes she did not cry, and Ruth had always found that more difficult to think about than if she had. Carol went back to school in January. 6 months later, an envelope arrived in the mailbox at Ruth and Marcus's house in Poughkeepsie with a Millbrook return address. Inside was $800 in cash and a note card. The note card said, in Carol's careful handwriting, "I just need to know she's okay. You don't have to write back." Ruth wrote back. She sent a photograph of Maya at 6 months, sitting in a high chair, and a single sentence: "She is healthy, and she is happy, and she is loved." Carol wrote back 3 weeks later. No money this time, just a note. It said, "Thank you. That's all." That was the beginning of it. For the next several years, it was occasional. A note from Carol, a photograph from Ruth, sometimes at the holidays, sometimes not. No schedule and no expectations. Carol asked once, in a letter, if Ruth would be willing to tell her small things. Not detailed updates, she wrote, just small things, so that I have something to hold. Ruth wrote back and said she would. After that, the letters came more regularly. Ruth told Carol about Maya's first steps and her first day of school, and the year she was obsessed with dinosaurs, and the year she decided she wanted to be a marine biologist, and the Christmas when she was 11, that she spent 3 weeks building a scale model of the Titanic out of balsa wood, and presented it to the family on Christmas morning with a detailed explanation of the structural failures that caused the ship to break in two. Ruth told Carol about Maya's teachers and her friends, and the apartment she and Marcus moved to in Kingston when Maya was 7, after his job transferred. Ruth told Carol about Maya's high school graduation, and the college she chose, and the degree she finished, and the job she got. And Carol, over those same years, told Ruth about herself. Not at first. At first, Carol's letters were only questions, only Maya, only what Ruth could give her. But after a while, slowly, the letters started to include Carol. She told Ruth when she graduated from college. She told Ruth when she got her first real job in the city. She told Ruth when she moved to New Jersey. She told Ruth, in a letter that arrived in the spring of the year we met, that she had been at a birthday party in Hoboken and had met someone, and that she did not know yet what it was going to be, but that it felt like something. I sat with that for a moment. Ruth looked at me and said, "She wrote to me about you often. I feel like I know you, in the way you know someone from one side of a window." I asked Ruth what Carol had written about me. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She wrote that you were one of the most decent people she had ever known, and that this frightened her. She wrote that she kept trying to find the moment to tell you about Maya, and that she could not find it. She wrote, about a year into your marriage, that she was afraid that if she told you the truth, you would see her differently, and that the version of her you saw was the version she wanted to be, even if it wasn't the complete version. She wrote, after you had been married for several years, that she had decided she would tell you when she retired, when the pressure of work was gone and there was more space. She wrote, after she was diagnosed, that she had run out of time and that she was sorry, and that she hoped you would be the person she knew you were." I did not say anything. Ruth reached into the drawer next to the stove and set 2 things on the table. The first was a banded stack of envelopes, maybe 60 or 70 of them, tied with a rubber band, the envelopes worn soft at the edges from handling. She said those were Carol's letters, everyone she'd written in 26 years, kept in order. The second thing was a small cardboard box. She slid the box across to me. Inside the box were photographs, dozens of them, printed on regular paper, the kind of photographs you print from a home printer. Slightly too bright, the colors a little off. They were photographs of Maya, from infancy to adulthood, organized by year, a date written in Ruth's handwriting in the lower corner of each one. Maya in a high chair, Maya in a school play, Maya with a gap-toothed smile in a second-grade class photo, Maya at a soccer game, mid-run, ponytail flying, Maya in a graduation gown, Maya at what looked like a birthday dinner, laughing, her head thrown back. Each photograph had a small note on the back, also in Ruth's handwriting. These were the photographs she had sent Carol over the years. Carol had kept all of them, and when Carol knew she was dying, she had mailed them back to Ruth with a note asking her to to give them to me when I came. I went through them slowly. I did not rush. Ruth sat across from me and did not say anything and let me take as long as I needed, and I took a long time. I went through all of them, from the earliest to the most recent, and I looked at each one, and I can tell you what it is like to look at 26 years of someone's life that you did not know about, compressed into a box of printed photographs on a kitchen table in a farmhouse in Dutchess County on a Wednesday in March. It is like reading the last chapter of a book before you've read the rest of it. You understand the shape of the story, and you can see what it cost, and you feel the absence of all the pages you did not get to read. I got to the most recent photographs. Maya, as an adult. She had Carol's dark hair and her own face, which was not Carol's face, but had Carol in it. Something in the eyes, something in the way her smile was a little more present on the left side than the right. She looked like a person who laughed easily and thought hard. She looked like a person who would spend 3 weeks building a model of the Titanic. I asked Ruth when these were from. Ruth said the most recent ones were from last fall, Maya's birthday. She had turned 26 in October. I asked Ruth if Maya knew about Carol. Ruth took a breath. She said no. She said that had been Carol's condition from the beginning, and one that Carol had held to even as it became harder to hold to. She said Carol had been very clear that Maya should not grow up knowing about her, should not grow up with the shadow of a mother who had given her away, should not spend her childhood or her adolescence waiting for a reunion that Carol was not certain she would be able to give. She said Carol had told her once in a letter from maybe 10 years ago that the decision to have no contact was the hardest thing she had ever done in her life, and also the thing she was most certain had been right, and that these two facts lived in her at the same time, and she had learned to hold both of them. I thought about that. Then Ruth said the last thing. She said, I want to tell you something about Maya. She said it carefully, with the precision of someone who has decided to cross a specific line and is doing so deliberately. She said, Maya moved to Hoboken 3 years ago for work. She works in environmental consulting. She lives in an apartment on Washington Street. She takes the PATH train into the city. I said, that's 20 minutes from Maplewood. Ruth said yes. I said Carol knew this. Ruth said yes. She said Carol had known for 3 years. She said Maya's move to the area had prompted the most difficult series of letters Ruth had ever received from Carol, letters that arrived sometimes twice in a week, which was unprecedented, letters in which Carol was trying to think through what it meant that her daughter was living 20 minutes away, and whether that changed anything, and what she owed Maya, and what she owed herself, and whether the original decision still held at this distance. Ruth said Carol had driven past Maya's street once, just once, that she told Ruth about. She said Carol had been in Hoboken for a work dinner, and had walked over to Washington Street and stood on the sidewalk outside Maya's building for about 10 minutes, and then turned around and walked back. She had written to Ruth about it afterward. The letter had said, I saw her light on in the second floor window. I didn't go in. I don't know if I was right not to go in, but I made a promise and I kept it, and now I don't know what the promise was protecting anymore. Ruth set one more photograph on the table. She said Carol had sent this one separately from the box in a separate envelope with a note attached. The note said, give this one to Daniel last so he knows what he's looking at. The photograph was recent, taken in the last year, Ruth said, from Carol's perspective, so from within the past 2 years of Maya's life. It was Maya on what looked like a running path along a river, in athletic clothes, stopped mid-run, caught by whoever was taking the picture in a moment between steps. She was squinting into the sun. She was smiling with her whole face. She had her chin tilted slightly down, the way Carol tilted her chin when she was about to say something she'd been thinking hard about. I held the photograph for a long time. I thought about Carol, driving to this farmhouse on Saturdays for 9 years. I thought about what those drives must have been like, what she was carrying on the way there and what she was carrying on the way back. I thought about the silence in the car on Saturday evenings, the tiredness I had always attributed to the road. I thought about the letters in that stack, 60 or 70 of them, 26 years of correspondence about a daughter Carol had given away and kept from a distance and loved in the only way she had been able to figure out how to love her without breaking the promise. I thought about Carol standing on a sidewalk in Hoboken with her daughter's light on in the window above her. I thought about the night we met, the birthday party, the man's father from Parsippany, pipe fittings and flexible supply lines. I thought about Carol watching me from across the room that night and deciding, on the basis of that I was someone she wanted to know. I thought about what she had been carrying already by then, at 28, 9 years into carrying it. I thought about what it would mean to love someone carefully for 9 years and carry that alone at the same time and never let one thing damage the other. And I thought about the particular kind of strength that required, and I thought that Carol had been that strong and I had not known it, and I would not have the chance to know it while she was alive. I set the photograph down. Ruth asked me if I was all right. I said I didn't know yet. She said that was fair. I asked her what she thought I should do. Ruth looked at me with the expression of someone who has been waiting 26 years to have some version of this conversation and has thought carefully about how to answer it. She said, I think Carol left this to you because she trusted you to do what she couldn't. She said, I think Maya has a right to know where she came from. She said, I'm not going to tell you it will be easy, and I'm not going to tell you she'll react well, because I don't know that. But she is 26 years old and she is a good person and she deserves to know that her mother loved her every single day of her life. I sat with that for a long time. Then I asked Ruth to write down Maya's address. Ruth wrote it on the back of a napkin, the same careful handwriting as the labels on the photographs, and pushed it across the table. I folded it and put it in my jacket pocket. I sat in that kitchen for another hour, going through the photographs a second time, reading 2 of Carol's letters that Ruth let me read. One from early on, practical, asking careful questions about Maya's health and development, and one from 7 years ago, personal, unguarded, full of the Carol I had known and some of the Carol I had not known. I cried during the second letter, which was the first time I had cried since the funeral, and Ruth sat across from me and did not say anything, which was exactly right. I drove home. I could not sleep. I sat at the kitchen table in Maplewood for most of the night, the napkin in front of me, trying to figure out what kind of person I was going to be. By morning, I had figured it out. I drove to Hoboken on a Tuesday, Washington Street. I sat in my truck in a parking garage 2 blocks away for about 20 minutes. I had written out on a legal pad on the passenger seat what I was going to say, but looking at it now, it seemed wrong. Too rehearsed, too organized, the kind of speech that would make a stranger think they were being ambushed. I left the legal pad on the seat. I got out of the truck. Her building had a buzzer panel by the front door. I found her name, M. Okafor 2B, and I stood there for a moment with my thumb near the button. It was 10 in the morning on a Tuesday. She might not be home. She might be at work. I would have to come back. I buzzed. The intercom crackled. A voice said, "Yeah?" I said, "My name is Daniel Merritt. I was married to a woman named Carol Merritt, who was born Carol Henley. I think she may have been your birth mother. I'm sorry to come to you like this. I have some things that belong to you and I thought you should have them." There was a long silence. Then the door buzzed open. She was standing in the doorway of her apartment when I came up the stairs. She was wearing a sweatshirt and her hair was up and she was holding a coffee mug, and the second I saw her face, I understood why Carol had been unable to walk away from the sidewalk that night. She had Carol's eyes, not the shape, her own shape, but the quality, the attention in them, the way they took you in and held you without giving anything away until they were ready. She looked at me for a long moment. She said, "How did you find me?" I said, "Ruth gave me your address." Something shifted in her face at Ruth's name. She stepped back from the door and let me in. We sat at her kitchen table, which was small and wooden and had a jar of pens on it and a half-finished crossword from the morning paper. I put the box of photographs on the table. I put Ruth's letters, the ones Ruth had given me to bring, on the table. I put the photograph of Carol at 19 in the green hospital gown, holding a newborn, on the table last. Maya looked at the photograph for a long time. She reached out and picked it up. She held it close to her face. She said, "Is this her?" I said, "Yes." She said, "What was she like?" I thought about Carol packing a bag on Friday evenings. Carol in the car on Saturday evenings, quiet in the way that I had always misread. Carol on the night we met, watching me talk to a stranger's father from across a crowded room and deciding that was enough to know. Carol coming home from the doctor on a Thursday afternoon and sitting at the kitchen table and not saying anything for 20 minutes. Carol writing a letter in this careful, even handwriting that looked like something a teacher would put on a blackboard, and folding it and sealing it and trusting that I would be the person she knew I was when I read it. I said, "She was the most careful person I have ever known." I said, "She paid attention to people in a way that was almost uncomfortable sometimes because it was so complete." I said, "She made promises and she kept them even when it cost her, and it cost her more than I knew for longer than I will ever fully understand." I said, "She loved you. She loved you every single day of your life, and she found the way she knew how to love you, and she held to it for 26 years, and I wish I had more to give you than that, but that's the truest thing I can tell you." Maya didn't say anything for a long time. Then she set the photograph down on the table, very carefully, and she put both hands flat on the table on either side of it, and she looked at it, and she started to cry. Not quietly, the way people cry when they have been holding something enormous for a long time, and the thing they were holding it with has just given way. I sat across from her at the small wooden table with the jar of pens and the half-finished crossword, and I watched her cry, and I did not say anything because there was nothing to say. And after a while, I put my hand on the table, not touching her hand, just near it, the way you sit near a person who is carrying something you cannot take from them but can at least be present for. She cried for a long time. So did I.